Hi everyone, in this video I will be making my very first epoxy river table. I will be pouring the most epoxy I have ever used and end up making a huge mistake. I will use unorthodox techniques and end up learning a lot. By the end, I will have made my most beautiful table yet. Make yourself comfortable, this is gonna be a fun one. Half a year ago I bought a sycamore tree. Well, not the whole tree, but only the bottom part, and all the slabs that came from it. One of which is this beautiful lengthwise cut along the axis of the tree. It has this awesome tiger stripe pattern, but it is quite crooked, as it was dried for almost 5 years. Until now, I was quite scared to start on this project, because this is one of the most expensive slabs that I have. As you can see, it is quite big, and the pattern on it is amazing, even without finish. So let's get to work making a table. The first step is going to be to flatten it, and for that I'm going to be using my router jig, which I actually sized for this exact slab when I built it. Since my router is really not that powerful, I need to use a smaller router bit and move slowly. This means that I will have to make multiple passes on the top of the table to remove material slowly and evenly. This is about the maximum thickness that I can route off from this high spot on the table. To make the surface even and flat, I will need to make about 3 or 4 passes on each side. You may wonder why I'm doing this on the ground, and that's because I don't have a workshop large enough to fit a table large enough that I can do this on. So that's why I chose to do it on the ground. And yeah, my knees will suffer for it, but I will have a nice and flat table. My router's cutting depth cannot be adjusted any lower, but thankfully I am a genius and I made my router jig adjustable in height. So I can just do this and it's ready for the second pass. I'm just messing around. This router jig really leaves a lot to be desired, but it got the job done and now the real work can begin. The first step is going to be to get this table 2 parallel sides. And for that, I'm going to be using my circular saw. I'm really not that adept at using a circular saw, so I opted to use multiple slices to cut this end off. And as I was cutting it, I felt really good about myself. The saw wasn't binding up, and I thought I had made a good slice. But after cutting it off, it looks disgusting, terrible, and it's not even flat. If you look at it from the side, it is on a 5-degree angle to the top of the table. So, on the other side, I'm going to be using a handsaw. This is a Japanese crosscut handsaw, and yeah, this is going to take a long time. Since I want to make a river table, I will need to cut this entire slab in half. That's why you can see a second red line perpendicular to the one that I'm cutting right now. And the thought of cutting the entire length of this table with a handsaw is just preposterous. I really don't want to do it. So I'm going to need to switch things up and find a different solution. In case you are wondering, this crosscut took about 30 minutes, but it was really tiring work. And cutting the entire length of the table, since it is not even a crosscut, is going to take even longer. But the cut looks clean and is perpendicular. So the question is, use a handsaw or use a circular saw? After weighing my options, I opted to use the circular saw, and I realized that I haven't changed the blade in 5 years or so. So let's get a brand new blade going. Hopefully the sharper and larger teeth will make a more even and nicer looking cut on the length of the table. So, out with the old and in with the new. Just to make sure my idea works, I cut off the ugly part that I made on my previous attempt, cleaned up the fuzzies with a flush trim saw, and I ended up with a way nicer finish. The next step was going to be to cut the thing in half. And yeah, I know not many people like river tables, but I've never made one, so I wouldn't know if I liked it. I never even saw one, so I wouldn't know if I liked it. So I had to make one for myself. And this cut, yeah, it had me worried, because this was an expensive slab. But as always, I'm up for the challenge. So I made the cut, and thankfully it turned out clean. So the idea is going to be this. Take off one side of this slab, switch it around, and there you go. There's your table. You just need to fill in about $200 worth of epoxy. And as a broke 20-something-year-old, mistakes are just not in the budget. So I'm gonna have to get this right on the first go. But before I can pour the epoxy, I really need to clean up this slab. There's lots of rotted sections in this wood piece, and these need to go because they will compromise the whole structure of the table and they don't look nice. So I need to remove them. I'm just using a blunt screwdriver to kind of hack away at all the cracks and all the crevices that are in this table to make sure that the epoxy will have a nice bond and the table will look desirable. I don't remove everything, but anything that is loose or could come loose as I pour the epoxy needs to go. After that, it's on to the sides of the table. Before the tree was kiln dried, there were all these bark beetles inside of the soft part of the tree, so the sides. And they left this kind of squiggly pattern on each of the live edges of this table. And this will need to be sanded down quite vigorously. But I won't remove all of it, as I want to have a really strong epoxy bond between the wood and the epoxy surface. And for that you need cracks and crevices that the epoxy can fill and kind of create a physical bond, as opposed to just a chemical one. There are all sorts of small cracks along the length of the wood, and these will need to be filled with epoxy. And the epoxy hides lots of mistakes, but it won't hide the fuzzy edges that are on these small cracks. So I just use a Dremel and a wire wheel and kind of make them nicer or clean them up a bit. I consume an inexorbitant amount of YouTube woodworking content, and most of these guys that work with epoxy and wood say that you need to seal in the top surfaces of your wood with epoxy. And I really didn't pay that much attention to these comments, because I didn't know what could happen if you did not do this step. And I actually experienced this failure firsthand on my previous project, which I didn't upload to YouTube. I experienced some staining of wood. I poured some black epoxy into another slab, and the wood actually soaked up all that black pigment from the epoxy and turned a different color. And it really looked unnatural and off-putting, so I had to scrap that project. And that's why I'm paying way more attention to this. But I think that as a hard-headed individual, that is the only way I can learn. So I need to experience the mistake for myself before I can actually internalize the solution. This is one of the reasons why I would say that you should be careful about this monkey see, monkey do type of attitude. So as you can see, I'm making the mold for this table. I'm making it out of melamine, and this is a good choice, because melamine really has a nice and shiny surface, and epoxy doesn't like to stick to nice and shiny surfaces. But unfortunately I didn't have two big enough pieces of melamine to pour this entire table, so I had to improvise and join two pieces together. That's all well and good, but if you take a look at the condition of my melamine, it is really old, really scratched up, and that kind of removes that shininess that makes the epoxy non-stick. So I will have to suffer for this mistake. And this is something that could have been prevented had I known the reason why melamine was used and the reason why you should pay careful attention about the surfaces that are going to be touching the epoxy. Anyways, other than that, I'm quite proud of my mold making, because I managed to seal every corner, every nook and cranny up with some sealant, and no major leaks happened outside of my mold. Here you can see me applying some mold release spray in 2 layers. The first layer is going to be buffed in to the surface of the melamine, and the second layer is just going to sit on top of the melamine. Next, you can see me applying some silicone to hopefully seal in all the edges of the wood, and hopefully no leaks and pools of epoxy will seep in under any of the wood pieces. Since my cuts on the ends weren't perfectly square, there will be a little gap, but this can just be sealed up with even more silicone. The aim of this meticulous mold building is to save as much epoxy as I can save, because epoxy is quite expensive, and as I've said before, I'm broke, so no major mistakes can happen. That is why I'm going to be pouring this epoxy in multiple layers, so that hopefully if the first layer leaks, I won't lose that much epoxy and I won't lose that much money. This is basically a question of timing and a question of measurement. If you can measure about the same amount of pigment that you add to each pour, then you will be fine. If you mess up the amount of pigment, then it will look a bit funky, but it's still salvageable. But if you mess up and pour epoxy into a spot which leaks, then you can lose a lot of money in epoxy. So that is the main thing that I want to avoid. In my workshop, pouring epoxy is really a timing thing. So I'm concerned about the drying time, which is 3 to 5 days depending on the temperature, and I'm also concerned about dust. So I cannot be working in my workshop as this is drying, because the dust would settle and kind of seep into the epoxy. After a day, epoxy turns into this gel consistency where it can still bond to fresh epoxy, but it will also be a bit more viscous, so any cracks or any kind of holes that the epoxy could have seeped out of will be plugged in. And that is great because my big river seems to be not leaking. However, that's not the case with this other huge section. All my epoxy that I've poured into it has leaked out. But that's life. And after letting the epoxy dry, I can break open my mold and check the damage. Or at least check where I have failed and where I have developed a crack that the epoxy could leak out of, so that I can plug it up and I can fill in that void. I was pretty surprised, but my sealant, which I've used to kind of fix this into place, has worked really well, and it's quite difficult to break apart this mold. But hopefully the wood will be easier to remove. I'm just using a chisel, a hammer, and this tube which I can use to add more leverage to my chisel. This is kind of an old chisel, so it's really not an issue if it gets banged up. Now let's get this table loose. And as I was starting out, everything seemed to work nicely, because I could get this section off. But I ran into a lot of trouble on the larger half of the mold. Like 2 days worth of trouble. I had to chisel out the melamine from under the table, and I didn't film this because I was cursing all the way through. So the reason seems to be that the epoxy leaked out and bonded to the wood and also to the melamine. And I have no idea how this happened. I mean, the leak I can understand. I didn't put a big enough bead of silicone. But how it bonded to the melamine with all the mold release, I just have no idea. Anyway, I cleaned it up with my router jig, and now it was time to fix these holes. The first step in this fix is to clean up the table. As I was routing out the melamine from underneath my table, I produced a lot of dust, and this needs to be cleaned out before I can pour again. By the way, I did this in the main pour. I vacuumed everything meticulously until it was nice and spotless. If you are wondering, at the current moment the table weighs about 50 kilograms, so almost as much as me. Anyways, back to the mistake. I'm going to tape up this sheet of melamine because tape seemed to work really well against these sticking issues. And I'm going to use a load of silicone to seal up these cracks, and hopefully this will prevent any leaks from happening. In my previous attempts with epoxy tables, this tape method seemed to work really well, so I'm hoping that it works today as well. But I'm just praying that I poured enough silicone onto this gap so that I can seal everything off and I won't lose any more epoxy. But just to make sure, I seal all the sides so as to create a completely hermetically sealed surface. Now for the other sections. So I mixed up a new batch, poured it in, and let it dry for 5 days. And this is the result. Everything seems to be in order. Let's check the other side. Well, it seems there's one tiny leak. But here's hoping that I can remove these pieces of melamine from the backside and I don't have to chisel them off one by one. And yeah, my method worked, and thankfully the epoxy didn't leak out that much. In the end, I think this mistake cost me about $20 worth of epoxy, which is not that bad, all in all, but the waiting time is a really huge setback. Since I have such a small shop, I cannot do any work while the epoxy is drying. So for 5 days, I basically had to wait. And yeah, that is quite a long time when you're trying to be a full-time woodworker. At this point, I was starting to get a bit concerned, because after removing half a centimeter, the epoxy still didn't fill up to the top, and the table was getting quite thin. It started out at 56 millimeters, and now it was at 40 millimeters, and I really didn't want this table to be any smaller than 35 millimeters, because then it would just look goofy. So that's why I decided to not use my router jig to route off the entire top surface, and I was gonna use a more precise method for fixing this kind of deeper spot in the epoxy, and that is my belt sander. I'd rather save about 3 millimeters of the table's surface and sand it for 2 days than to lose it and finish in 2 hours. So yeah. That may be the wrong call, but that's the one I made while I was doing it. So I put on a really aggressive grinding belt and I got to grinding. PPE is really important, but listening to music is way more important when you're doing this boring sort of work, so that you don't lose focus and can put your heart into it all the way through. So that's why I bought these like really cheap earbuds, and they fit under my hearing protection and they protect actually even a bit better, and basically I've created hearing protection headphones. I'm really proud of myself because this has saved my sanity, because sanding for 2 days is just really boring. After sanding the top flat, the hard part was over, and now I could finally get to shaping the final form of the table. My sanding job looks really nasty at this point because I was using an aggressive grit, but it's gonna get a whole lot prettier. Now let's flip it over and do the other side as well. As you can see, the epoxy still leaked out, but it was localized on small areas, so the loss was really insignificant, and I could clear it up quite fast. However, since this was the underside of the pour, there are still some minor cracks left in the wood from the other side which the epoxy didn't touch, so these will need to be filled in with some different methods. I want to choose a filler material that is really similar to epoxy and that has the same pigment in it. So I opted to use hot glue, and I just melted it in with the same pigment that I used for the epoxy and created this black hot glue glob that I'm going to be using with a torch and a slab of marble. The marble is important because its top surface is quite flat and it is also really dense and cold, so it cools the hot glue really fast, and that means that the job is way quicker this way. I basically just fill the gap with hot glue, put on the marble slab, wait about 20 seconds and then take it off. Then I can use a really sharp chisel to kind of cut away at the top surface of the hot glue, and it comes off cleanly and looks almost indistinguishable from the epoxy when sanded. The reasoning for using hot glue instead of epoxy to fill these holes is twofold. One is the time concern, which I've talked about already. I don't want to wait 5 days for the epoxy to dry once more. And the second reason is the epoxy's surface tension is way higher than hot glue. So if you heat up hot glue, it flows into these holes really easily. And if you do it with epoxy, then you need to work it a lot longer, and it can go really wrong quite fast, because if it doesn't fill in the gap, then it flows on the surface of the wood, and then it could stain it and it could seep into the pores, and that's really not what you want. So that's why I opt to use this black hot glue instead of using black epoxy. This technique works well for these mid-sized holes, and the very small ones you really don't need to worry about because CA glue will fix them up. But for the larger ones, you cannot use hot glue. As you can see, I filled one of these up, and if I mark it with my fingernail, there's definitely a visible indentation, and that is not okay on a premium table. So I scraped it out, and I'm gonna use epoxy one last time to fill these holes up. After waiting 5 days, I can sand them flat with my belt sander. Now that I've finished all the corrections on the top and bottom side of the table, I can actually start to form it. And the first step in forming the table into a table shape is to cut it to length. And for that, I'm going to use my router because it is just way more precise than my circular saw, and I really can't afford to let anything else go wrong. So even though this is going to take a bit longer, I am way more confident with this tool, so I will hopefully produce a way better result. Once again, I take multiple passes and clear out the chips in between each pass. After reaching the end of my router bit, I cannot go any deeper with my router, so I switch over to my jigsaw to finish the cut. With this method, a small chunk of wood will still be left hanging on the underside of the table, but I can just use a flush trim router bit to clean it up. A flush trim router bit basically just references a surface and copies that surface onto the cutting edge of the knife. So if you copy a flat surface, it will copy a flat line on the cutting edge. And this is the result. As you can see, there's still a small burr left after changing the router bits, but I can just sand these flat and the table will have nice perpendicular edges. I need to repeat this method 3 more times to make each side of the table nice and flat and perpendicular to the 2 sides next to them. At this point in the build, I have some creative freedom on what I want to do with the edges. And I decided to keep it simple because the table is so interesting, so I'm only going to add a symmetrical chamfer to all edges of the table. But before that, I wanted to get a head start on the top finish and the bottom finish, because this aggressive grit removes a lot of material, and if you remove material after putting on the chamfer, then that can alter the dimensions of the chamfer and it can look wonky. Even though both sanding processes, so the belt sander and the eccentric sander, used the same grit, the finish definitely looks way nicer after hitting it with the eccentric sander. Now it's time to tackle all the edges. For this, I'm just going to use a 45-degree chamfer bit and move along each side of the table. As you can see, I've managed to make some burn marks, but that's only at the start of my chamfer, so they will sand out just fine. After a certain degree of sanding, I think that it is important to add something soft under your tabletop, so like this piece of cardboard, because if any debris gets under your table that is harder than the tabletop surface, then the cardboard will kind of just integrate it into itself. And this fixes any scratches that can come from moving the tabletop around. After finishing up these chamfers, I'm reasonably happy because they turned out quite okay. And now it's on to finish sanding. I move on from 80 grit to 120 and then to 180. And during the finishing process I will actually move on to 240, but that I'm going to do by hand. I occasionally turn all the lights but one off in my workshop to check how the reflection on the table looks, because this way it's way easier to see any scratches that are still in the table. After finishing up with each grit, I vacuum the whole table and then water pop it. This raises the grain of the wood and makes it way easier and faster to sand, and also results in a much cleaner and much nicer looking finish. After finishing up the tabletop with 180 grit, I move on to all my beveled edges. To do this, I just wrapped a piece of sandpaper around an old rasp, and I'm moving really carefully across each beveled edge to make sure to not round off the corners. This is a really satisfying part of the build, at least I really enjoyed it. I'm not quite sure why I'm showing you this, but this is the ugliest of the chamfers that I've made. All the other ones look way better, but anyways, this is going to be the next step, to add the third bevel on the edge. And this creates this kind of tri-point that you need to sand down to create this little triangle. At this point I'm still using 80 grit sandpaper for the sides, but then I'm going to move up in grit and make them smooth and a bit more even looking. After that, I'm going to break all the edges. And for this, I just bent a piece of sandpaper kind of lightly around my palm, and I'm hitting each corner that kind of feels sharp, so that when you run your finger across the table, it feels nice and smooth. After finishing up the sanding process, I'm quite happy with my result, and I'm super excited to see what this table actually looks like when some finish is applied. So I prepped the finishing table, and this is just 2 pieces of angled wood, which will act as a raised surface for my table. And then I vacuumed the whole table, and first I'm gonna clear it with some water. This removes all the small dust particles that were left after vacuuming. After this, I will be using some mineral spirits to clean up all the oils from my hand and all the waxes and all the nasty stuff that's in the wood, to make sure that my finish sticks on evenly and nicely. Doing this also raises the grain of the wood, which will make the finish penetrate a bit deeper. And I'm going to be applying 2 layers of finish. So first I'm gonna apply some hardback soil and then sand it down with 240 grit, and then apply another coat of hardback soil. The choice of hardback soil is obviously Rubio Monocoat, since it has been recommended by literally everyone and it works like a charm. At least in my experience it has worked like a charm, and I'm open to trying something new out, so if you have any suggestions on what different alternatives I could use instead of Rubio, probably something a bit cheaper, then that would be appreciated. If you have made it this far in this video, then I thank you very much for watching, because this has been one of the most fun builds that I've ever done, even with all my mistakes that I've made. Since I've learned so much and I've improved so much, my next table is sure to be twice as good. If you enjoy this type of content, then please consider subscribing, as I plan to make way more woodworking videos, and even though I'm just a beginner, I'm planning on doing this a long time. So I want to improve these skills, and I want to make something even better and even nicer looking. If you have any questions or comments about techniques that you saw in this video, or that you would like to see me try out, then please leave them in the comment section below. Or if you just want to make fun of me because I used something improperly, or I didn't wear PPE when PPE was absolutely necessary, then I can take criticism pretty well, so please leave those in the comments too. Anyways, what you can see me doing here is using my eccentric sander with a felt pad to kind of smooth out the finish and make it look even. I found that if you don't do this, then you can get some spots where your finish is shinier than in other spots, and I'm not sure why this happens. I've never heard anyone else complain about this on Rubio, but buffing in your finish is super important. After buffing in my finish, I set a timer for 5 minutes and wait for the wood to soak up all that Rubio. After that's done, it's time to wipe off all the excess. I'm not quite sure why you would do this, but the manufacturer recommends wiping off the finish, so I do it, but I haven't had any issues previously with leaving on a bit too much. Or maybe I'm buffing it in a bit too much, and that kind of removes the purpose of wiping it off. Anyways, if you have any experience with letting some hardback soil sit on your wood for a longer time, then please let me know, because I'm quite interested. Now it's on to the other side, and since I've made symmetric chamfers on the edges of the table, I can decide at any point which side I want to be the top of the table. Well, until I actually put some legs on it. But I haven't yet found legs that would be suitable for this table, so I'm just gonna use some black IKEA legs as stand-ins, and if I found something, then I'm gonna screw those into the table. The IKEA legs I'm only going to attach with some hot glue for the beauty shots. And with that said, let me show you how this table turned out.